Thank you both. You know, our theme is controversial: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I know most of this conversation is going to be about the second part of that. But I thought we might as well get the most sensitive part out of the way first with the first question. So tell me, what's your favorite song?
I had a feeling you were going to ask that, and I wish I had a really fun answer. I said now most of my music is all based around my 4 kids, so we've just been listening to the Captain Underpants soundtrack, Lego Batman soundtrack, yeah, and that's really what I'm into right now.
I know, Patrick, for you it used to be show tunes, but what is it now?
No, it's about the same as Amy said. We have Alexa, and so everybody's shouting Alexa in our house. Alexa, 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 because they all want to get their particular song played. I just say Motown, and then it comes back and says, this will be these will be a collection of songs of Motown favorites. And then it just plays incessantly, which is fine with me. Don't have to worry about which song I want to hear, because they're all pretty good to me.
Terrific.
Yeah. The right answer would have been our wedding song, but that's fine. That's fine.
I'm sure there'll be opportunities in the course of this conversation to get it right. And so I know that it's not possible that we can have a conversation like this and it's not going to turn to policy. I mean, it seems like every time I'm in a room with Amy, the conversation turns to policy. I don't know why that is, but I think it's just because she's a policy wonk who's been immersed in policy her entire adult life. But let's start, if we can, with something that's more personal. One of the things, Patrick, that I had really thought about in the first time I read your book, and I've been spending some time rereading it to prepare myself for this, is how typical, in many respects, your childhood was. I mean, you talk about a common struggle. And here you were as a youngster with parents in the midst of a divorce. It's about the time you began to see signs and symptoms of what would be diagnosed as a mental health condition, a mental illness emerge. There was some misunderstanding that they might have been related to asthma. I can't believe you were on high doses of prednisone, which would have masked those symptoms or created those same kinds of symptoms. But really, a lot of your story happened before the age of 14, like 50% of other kids. Isn't that right?
That's correct, yeah. So, people hear a common struggle like, what do I have in common with a Kennedy, right? It's totally unusual, totally abnormal. And the reason I said a common struggle, because you change the names and you change the circumstances, the essence of the story is the same, and that is that we never talked about what was really going on in our family. And I find that transcends pretty much every difference that we would otherwise have, and goes to the essence of the big challenge we have in the fight to improve mental health. We can't have that fight, like your hashtag, until we come out in the open and we fight. And the problem with most Americans is they don't want to come out in the open because they're still under that old mistaken notion that this is a moral failing, not a medical failing. And in my case, obviously, they say alcoholism runs in families. Well, it gallops in my family. And I had kind of the perfect storm of a genetic predisposition coupled with, as you said, Paul, a divorce. But most impactful to me was the fact that my mom's untreated alcoholism. I mean, she occasionally would go off to Silver Hill, or maybe she did Betty Ford one time. I don't know, McLean Hospital. But it was like most treatment was, even unfortunately to this day, and that was episodic. Episodic. And we all know that these illnesses need chronic care management and continuity of care. She never received that. I never received that, and it was ironic because I still felt like, well, I should be all set now. I just got cleaned up and went to treatment, And I come out, and then I'm under the same delusional thinking that I've got this, forgetting the fact that the main challenge of a mental health condition is the lack of insight into your condition and your ability to quickly fall under the delusion that you're in control of your illness, as opposed to it being in control of you unless you get the proper treatment. So it's a long way of saying, you know, my family was traumatized by the fact that my mom, you know, was very exhibited all of the really tragic, you know, characteristics of alcoholism, and we never knew what to do about it, and no one talked about it, which was really the thing that was so grinding. And we knew that you weren't supposed to talk about it. We all hoped and prayed she'd go back to her room and shut the door as opposed to embarrassing us. And my dad was constantly being attacked for his own behavior. And, you know, it wasn't until I followed the history of this mental health movement and I recognized that it took us a long time as a nation to recognize post-traumatic stress. You know, it was never something, it was always, you just got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We still have that mentality with our returning soldiers. And then I thought to myself, because I'm doing this work on mental health and we're trying to get the whole DSM, and people are wondering what's this post-traumatic stress. And by the way, until 9/11, we really didn't have a public understanding of trauma and its impact on the brain and on people as a result. And my dad fit, you know, the exact, you know, characteristic of someone who would suffer post-traumatic stress. I mean, when they wrote all these stories about what my dad went through after he passed, one of the stories I read had a passage in there about how in every closet in our house we had bulletproof vests. You think about today's tragedy, and my heart goes out to Steve, who I served with, Steve Scalise and his family, and you know, the Capitol Police officers. We lived with that all the time, the fear of being shot. I mean, it was like we had security intermittently, there were always threats, and we had bulletproof vests in all of our closets. Like, that was normal to me. I'm like, what? You know, like they said, oh, you had bulletproof vests? I'm like, yeah, don't you? You know, it's like, it just didn't occur to me that that's not normal. And so I can't imagine what my father went through. I do know that he was the most resilient, incredibly persevering human being I've ever met or will ever meet. And so he carried on. He did his best being present for me. He hugged me all the time. I think he was still, in his generation, you know, emotions and feelings weren't shared as a regular, you know, thing. But he managed to do really well by me, I have to say, with all the challenge that I faced and his inability to often communicate his own emotional feelings and so forth. The one thing he really did right, which I pass on, as Amy knows, I hold my kids every time I'm with them. We're walking down, I'm holding one of them. When one of them asks, you know, hold me, hold me, hold me, my little, you know, Nora goes, hold me, hold me, hold me. And Amy says, she's too big to hold now. You put her down. I'm like, no, I want to hold these kids. Because what a difference it made to me that my dad held me and just hugged me. And that, I think, kind of helped, even though I had a lot of other challenges, kind of keep me centered, even though there were, you know, many challenges.
So the myth is, it's bad parenting.
Yes.
And I remember, I mean, we've all followed the stories about your family and about your dad and all this. So the myth is bad parenting, right? Yeah. The other myth is it's some inherent weakness within the individual. You know, you, I think, said you got drunk the first time you were 10 years old. You're binge drinking at 13. It's not that, though. I mean, it's also a common element of this, isn't it?
Right.
It's got nothing to do with bad parenting. It's got nothing to do with an internal weakness, character flaw that kids have. This is simply the realities that so many of us face and so many of our families face. It's just typical before the age of 14.
But, you know, we have, as we know, with all other illnesses, a genetic predisposition. And the environment can help, you know, really exacerbate that. And so we're going to be really careful because we know it runs with our kids and their genetic makeup. So we have to be really on it. And I think that was people dismiss, oh, teenagers, they'll drink, they'll smoke pot, they'll do drugs. And we really need to look at the antecedents to the current addiction overdose crisis. And I think a lot of it is this dismissive attitude about the impact of early exposure to drugs and alcohol. So we live in Atlantic City, New Jersey. So I watched that Boardwalk Empire. I don't know if anybody's seen it. It's all about the Prohibition era. And I come to think, you know, alcoholism, I mean, had to have been so big back then for them to actually pass Prohibition. You know, so I just got appointed to this commission on the opiate epidemic. And I think to myself, this is the biggest public health challenge of our country right now, is the suicide rate and the overdose rate, which frankly are just tragically only the tip of the iceberg to the size and scope of this epidemic. I mean, if you can think about these suicide rates and overdose, they're staggering. And yet we know underneath them is the kind of suffering that's affecting every family in America. And yet we're still, as a nation, doing very, very little when compared to what we would otherwise be doing if this were an infectious disease or some other illness that was affecting our country. We would be throwing hundreds of billions of dollars.
Before stage 4.
Before stage 4. So I would just say, yes, we have a lot to do, and while, you know, it's not bad parenting, I do think, you know, the environment and being aware and doing that education that Senator Franklin was talking about, and literacy, you know, the understanding and awareness of mental illness and where and how it can be impacted for parents, for families, big, big difference in how kids can get a better start in life. And this has been Amy's main focus as a public school teacher, is understanding that you can't teach literacy and numeracy if the kids can't focus and if they've got these ACE scores that no one's bothered to, you know, check when it comes to their ability to learn.
So let's bring Amy in on this question. I mean,
you like the way I just pivot that right over to Amy?
Yeah, and I was planning to grab it and send it her way anyway.
I felt that way.
Yeah, you saw that coming. Yeah. I know. So we got ahead of it. Yelled charge. Got ahead of the crowd, right? And but Amy, no, let's stay on kids for one more minute before we turn to adults and family and stuff. You've seen a lot of kids like Patrick.
Yeah.
And tell me about what it's been like as a teacher and what it could be like.
Well, I would say that that myth is probably one of the reasons that as a teacher in the classroom, when I saw things in my students that I was concerned about, prevented me from maybe taking the next step, because I didn't want to imply, you know, to the parents that maybe they were doing something wrong. And so being able to feel comfortable with talking to the parents when I saw a concern, because, you know, I'm looking at 100 students, all the same age, and so you really do notice that there's something going on here, maybe this should be addressed. But to bring that to a parent-teacher conference and be able to speak up when you say, you know, I could say, oh, they seem like they're having a little trouble with the other student, but to be able to take that next, you know, step and say, I think that you maybe should seek some outside help for this. I would like to have the student, you know, maybe you talk to somebody, was then uncomfortable for me because I didn't have the right language for it. I didn't want them to feel shame, feel like I was calling out their child for doing something wrong or for being different than any of my other students. So I was so comfortable with telling them and being narrowly focused on the academics and saying, well, they didn't hand in these homeworks and they didn't do these assignments and they failed these tests, which a lot of times were an indication that there was something else going on. But I couldn't talk about the emotional piece of it. And I was not alone in that. You know, I really regret that I wasn't more comfortable with it, that I wasn't trained. I went to a great university and I had a lot of time.
Penn State,
I
right?
went to Penn State. I love Penn State.
Nittany
We were
Lions.
just up there, yeah. We were just up there speaking this year, and we toured their facilities, and we talked again to the dean of the School of Education about what are they doing to train teachers. Because you go into the classroom, and I've learned how to teach math, and I've learned what to do in history class, but I haven't gotten any experience in how to handle all the challenges that my students are facing that maybe they will not seek any help outside of school. And the guidance counselors in our school are overwhelmed with administrative duties. So I think a lot of parents are at a point where they're feeling like they hope the guidance counselor will take care of some of the issues, you know, that they would know. They haven't heard from the school. They would know if there was a problem because the school would tell them, or you know, the teacher would send them to the guidance counselor. But that's not always the case. I wish I had had more training, and it still is not the standard procedure for teachers to get a lot of training. We're seeing a lot of teachers being trained in special education, but this piece of dealing with ACE and any trauma, the teachers aren't even aware of it. You know, it's a new concept, even though the study's so old.
I tell this story sometimes. I was talking to a friend of mine once, some years ago, and my son was going through a lot of problems at school. And he'd been one of the lawyers who worked in the Carter administration doing the regulations for what became the IDEA. Mm-hmm. And I remember turning to him and saying, you know, Peter, you know, pointing to my son Tim at that point, is this what you had in mind when you were writing these regs? And he looked at me and said, Paul, we were thinking of kids in wheelchairs. And it's the idea that we never thought to train teachers about the inclusion of kids with SED, you know, with serious mental illnesses. And we really haven't come that long away yet, have we? So it's Penn State now that you're up there and you guys did this?
Trying.
Are they all like ready to go and lead
We're
this?
trying. You know, it was not until I met Patrick that I even was able to recognize my own deficits in that area. So, you know, we started going to events. We saw Flawless Foundation speak and talk about how students were, you know, kind of being helped in a lot of areas and gaining in their reading abilities. If they had, you know, dyslexia, there was a program for that, and there were teachers trained in how to help them with that. But that the same wasn't true if they were exhibiting behaviors in class. They were still being penalized for it, even though that might just be a presentation of something else that was going on. And I thought about all the red flags I'd seen through, you know, at that point it was about 12 years of teaching, that I'd had students. My very first year, I had a student with oppositional defiance disorder, and I had no skills for how to best handle that student in my classroom and make the most of his learning experience, and probably, in fact, made it worse. And then when I had another student with the same diagnosis 10 years later, I had gotten better at not letting it disrupt my classroom, but I hadn't given any more benefit to that student. You know, so I had classroom management skills. I was able to not engage in behaviors on my end that would, you know, escalate the situation. But I still don't think that he really got a whole lot out of it. And yet, you know, for him, the history lesson that I was teaching really probably shouldn't have been the priority. That's not what he needed at that point in his life. was, the dates and the Civil War battles. There was a lot more he needed from my class and from school in general than, this history lesson.
So come back to family for a minute, and let's jump forward about 30 years in Patrick's life. Mm-hmm. So Patrick, you met Amy about 7 years ago now, and you became sober about 6 years ago now. So tell us, what's the relationship between those two things?
So Al Franken left, but I went out to an event for him. He had a big recount. I don't know if you all remember when Al Franken was first elected. It took months and months and months for them to finally declare him the winner. And I went out in the midst of all this. The DFL out in Minnesota had this big event, and I was out there. We were rallying the troops for him to get over the finish line. And he took me out afterwards to this bar, and I was like, this is like so unusual. Like, he's the principal guy, and he grabbed me, he goes, let's go. And it was just me and him, and I felt obviously very excited by this opportunity. So we went to this bar, and they had all these funny names for these drinks, and of course, I had to say, I'll have the virgin version of this drink, no alcohol. And I remember I wanted to get Al, which doesn't take much. So one of the drinks was called Sex on the Beach. So I knew he'd like that one. He could really make a lot of this one. So I said, I'd like to have sex on the beach without the alcohol. And he goes, how do you do that? I'll never forget that, Al Franken. How do you do that? Anyway, I just had to throw that out there. It was my favorite Al Franken story. And he laughed. It was good. So now I've totally lost my train of thought.
You were becoming sober at the time.
Yeah, I was becoming sober.
You met Amy. Remember,
so
the right
answer
was Amy?
It was ironic because I met Amy right after I had announced that I wasn't going to run for re-election. So,
and she had avoided you up until then? Was that?
So right after I announced that I wasn't going to run for re-election, I was scheduled to speak at the Arc of New Jersey. Rob Andrews and Frank Pallone, who both had helped Parity, by the way, they were terrific chairs of the various subcommittees. They're terrific people. So they asked me to come because it was the whole state of New Jersey's ARC, and they're very active in the IDD community in New Jersey. And they were honoring my Aunt Eunice Shriver for all of her work with Special Olympics and everything. So I figured I'll make, Frank Pallone and Rob Andrews happy, check. I'll make my Shriver cousins happy if I do this, check. And of course, the trifecta, and I use trifecta because we're in Atlantic City, and it's all about gaming and gaming terminology. So the trifecta was that I met my future wife at this event. And her dad was a special ed teacher, bought tickets to this dinner. He decided not to go, gave her the tickets, her and her mom the tickets instead. And of course, I spotted her, as you can see why. And I went up, tried to go find her, and I couldn't. Then, to my good, graces, I saw her in the line waiting to get her program signed. And I'm thinking, I'm in Atlantic City. She wants me to sign her program. This is all set. So she comes up and gives me her program and then says, this is for my father. He couldn't be here, but he would have really liked you to sign this. And I'm like, wait a second, what about you? I didn't say that, but that was what was going through my head. So I signed. I said, what's your dad's name? Jerry. I said, to Jerry, sorry to miss you, but it was great to meet your beautiful daughter, Amy. And then I closed the book and she was wondering, why did it take so long for me to sign this program? She walked about 20 steps away and then looked at what I had signed. And I was waiting for the reaction. I was like, is this a green light, red light? And she smiled, that beautiful smile. and it was all over. So, but of course, it wasn't all over for my, self-medicating. My addiction was still raging. And it was raging all the way through the end of my term in Congress, where I ended up in a Virginia, Richmond, Virginia psychiatric hospital. Who knows how that was the referral. And all my staff, had to leave when they were going off to new jobs. My office had been pared down quite dramatically. And I literally had like 2 weeks to go in my term. My whole 16 years in Congress. 2 more weeks, and mostly at the end of your term, the last 2 weeks, it's kind of everybody says goodbye, and you do floor speeches, how great it was to serve. I was, just like it happened to me in high school, I never graduated with my classmates. And so I never left Congress with my colleagues. I just disappeared and ended up in this Virginia psychiatric hospital. And I just knew that my life had changed dramatically. I'd already made the decision that I couldn't go on in Congress. And I was really at a breaking point. What was I going to do? And so everyone told me that I had to go to more than my usual kind of 28-day program. So I decided to go to a 6-month program. And I went to that program.
I thought you were going to say I decided to go to New Jersey.
It gets to New Jersey. So I go to this program, like most people with addiction, you want to get out of there the moment you get there. And that was my feeling. So I'm saying, let me go. And they said, you just got here. I said, yeah, but I have to meet this woman because my future rests on, my relationship with her.
And they bought that?
Well, I guess they didn't. I didn't give them a chance. So I left. I came up to New Jersey for Christmas to be, because Amy had invited me to be with her family if I were around, and so I took her up on that. And then I never left. And she knew that I was supposed to go back to treatment. So she said to me, this is all over if you don't stay sober. And so that was a really good motivation. So I found out where the local AA meeting was literally quarter mile down the street from her house. And I had rented a little place across the street. And I started going there every day of the week. And it was a little, I had some slips, and I never really knew I was going to stay with it. Because I never counted my days. Never. I always had, quote-unquote, reservations to go back out. And my dad's birthday came and went. And Amy had expected me to go on a bender because my dad was like my guy. And I always got worked up when I thought about him. So I didn't do that. I still went to my meeting. And I realized that would be my sobriety date, because that was the day I decided that if I make it through this, it's just a commitment now to just do this and follow this. And miraculously, one day at a time, it's been over 6 years of continuous sobriety. So Amy didn't really know me. I, like most addicts, manipulated. I kept the thing hidden to some extent. We all think we can hide it more than we do, but I did my best to put on my best face with her. Fortunately, I didn't, I wasn't active in my illness for too long in our relationship.
How did you know what to do, Amy? I mean, did you just intuit this to figure out how to change the trajectory of a life like this? Or is it just, you said you weren't trained as a teacher to recognize this in kids. How did you know what to do? You obviously figured this out. Was it on the fly? Did you have to guess? What can you tell the rest of us?
Yeah.
How can we be like this?
Well, when I met Patrick, I didn't really know. I knew that he had a history of substance use, just from Wikipedia, what I had seen, but I didn't know. And when
You
we
Googled the guy,
yeah,
weren't quite
that's
sure
right.
who this was. It's like, yeah, okay, got it.
So I didn't know because we were long distance for a while. He was still working in Washington, and I was teaching in New Jersey. And so when we saw each other, it was on the weekends, and it was for, a short amount of time, and I didn't really know. And then, of course, we started spending more time together. And, as I found out more about kind of what he was going through and how he was feeling, I saw in Patrick that he was so tired of living the way he was living, and that he really wanted to have a different life. And so that would be my first recommendation, is that it's not something that I can, impact him. He was already in the mindset that he was ready to make a big change. Obviously, when he decided not to run for Congress again, that was a really serious move. Then he followed that up by moving to New Jersey and just really changing his entire lifestyle. And that gave me some, hope and comfort that I thought that this was really a priority for him. So when he did that, and I saw how committed he was, I knew that it was not going to be a smooth path, that it was going to be, some difficulties. But I also didn't change my life. He just came and fit into it. So I think having, my parents and my family there, and I already had a daughter, so she was my focus, and saying, if you want to be a part of this, that's great, but this is what we're going to need from you, and I'm going to keep moving forward in the way that I always have, and we would love to have you there if you think that you can do this. And so in doing that, Patrick really had to make even more drastic lifestyle changes just to live with my parents. It was, that of itself was probably more of an
He's
impact.
always spoken so highly of them.
It is, yeah. He has to. Right?
I'm a good politician. What can I say?
That's right. But I think,
This is live on Facebook.
Yeah, that's right.
Jerry Laney, I really love you.
Yeah. They were really crucial to Patrick's health and recovery. I
know that, by the way.
Yes.
For everybody who hadn't read the book,
Yeah.
that is so clear in
Yeah,
the book,
it's
too, so.
because I went to work each day, and Patrick was unemployed. And my mom was there, and so it was my mom that, who was also a teacher, and my dad, who were there and really spent time with Patrick when he first was, alone, new state, new city, and looking for direction. And really, I think were supportive, but also really structured. My parents, they're not going to even buy a sugary cereal, so you better get on the straight and narrow at their house. And I had already been going to Al-Anon meetings. As the senator said, I really found those helpful, and I'd been attending those before I met Patrick. So that gave me a base as well for kind of my own strength and knowing when I would think that something was kind of pushing my discomfort level with where he was and where I was going to, say this is too much. Yeah. As everybody in here knows, having kids really can make you stand a firm line for protecting yourself and them from, trauma or experiencing things that you don't want them to be around. And Patrick has always had, before we had children, he was already paternal and just had that instinct of wanting to do the best for Harper. So I think that was a good sign for me.
Back to his father.
Yeah.
Go ahead. back to the role model of his father, sort of back to the paternal role model,
Yeah,
the really good
that's where I
dad
get
in that
it
respect
from.
that you picked up. We've got just a few minutes, and I want to sort of end with, if we can, the fact that now your lives, the professional lives, have come together too.
Right.
And so the Kennedy Forum is, moving on, doing well. You guys are working together. Want to tell us a little bit about what's on the horizon?
Well, I love your screenings. I wish I had had that as a tool, as a teacher, that I could have
Remember, you're on the board, so there are our screenings.
I know, our
Yeah,
screenings.
okay, our screenings.
Because
yeah.
that would, for me, would have been.
plugging them.
I know.
Yeah, she's plugging
I would have
them.
been
Like a
able
good
to
board
say.
Reggie was happy with that. Thumbs up.
Now I just got to get you to say 42 CFR Part 2.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it just would have been a helpful tool for me, being uncomfortable with trying to make a diagnosis, which wasn't in my wheelhouse as a teacher, to be able to just say, I'm not sure, but why don't you try this screening or have your child, take a look, see if you think it fits, and let people come to that realization and move from there. And Senator Franken mentioned having a therapist right within the school. Through Kennedy Forum, we have a list of recommendations, and as much as we could make the school a place where the community can use that as a resource, and we can partner with other groups and have early intervention, have assessments in the school, so that they're not just being screened for their hearing and their eyesight and their scoliosis, but that this is something else. That we have all the teachers trained and know what to do, not only when there's a lockdown, but when there's a crisis for mental health, that they would know what to do, and just working on finding evidence-based methods for building resiliency in kids. So for me, that's where I'm focused, and then Kennedy Forum's doing things in some other areas too.
So as you heard Senator Franken talk about the continued fight for parity, parity relies on us having health insurance, because what we need is to have health insurance in order to get the parity within that health insurance for mental health and addiction. If you have no health insurance, you have no parity. So that is why we're in such a critical moment in this country. And in the history of our fight for mental health, we've made such great strides, as you heard Senator Franken, with the ACA, the implementation of essential health benefits, the application of parity. All of it is on the line right now as we speak. The fact that we can't get Senator Portman to automatically say, hey, no way. He is living at ground zero of this opioid crisis. He has been terrific, by the way. Absolutely terrific. Love what Senator Portman has done speaking out on this issue. But the fact that we can't even get him to commit against this, hard and fast, this idea that block grants are going to take the place of a healthcare system. In mental health, we don't want block grants. I know we all rely on block transfer. And we're kind of hooked because that's the way money has flowed in mental health. I mean, let's just be honest. That's the way we've gotten our money in mental health for treatment. But in the future, we just want to have health care insurance so that we can get continuity of care and apply quality metrics to the kind of care that is being delivered, so we actually get the kind of outcomes we want for people who are getting treatment. None of that's going to be possible if they block grant, because we're not going to be able to effectuate quality standards with these block grant approach, where the money's going to run out 2/3 the way through the year because of a very state's economic condition. This is not the way to fight the largest public health crisis in our nation. So, obviously that's issue number one. But we love what you guys have all done to help us with mental health parity implementation. Now, we really want to step that up and create a parity registry. I hope you all go on to parityregistry.org. Parityregistry.org is a 1.0. We're going to migrate it to a 2.0 and 3.0. But the idea there is to get people in all 50 states to start to complain to their attorneys general because what we don't want to do is have you all and your family members have to file your own appeals for denials of care and think that you're going to have to take on the big insurance companies all alone, because that, we know, has not worked. What we really need is to do what Eric Schneiderman has done in New York, the Attorney General of New York, and that is give him the information, let the Attorneys General investigate whether there's a pattern and practice of more onerous medical necessity determinations placed on those seeking mental health and addiction care, and then they can bring the case. If the Attorney General brings the case, you can get all kinds of benefits. Not only will you get financial benefits in the settlement, which can go to more treatment, but you can get structural benefits in the way the insurance company then behaves after the lawsuit, through consent decrees. And that's what he's done in New York, and we've actually eliminated pre-authorization for Cigna and Anthem that have been national benefits that have now begun eliminated pre-authorization for MAT, and it was all because of an Attorney General decision in one state. So the fight we have now is to pick and choose, just like the NAACP did when they were trying to enforce the Civil Rights Act. We have to pick and choose where our battles are, because winning our battles in one state, and this is your whole country here represented with your leadership, can mean the victory for everyone else in the room. So Mental Health America was the organization that helped lay the foundation for parity. You guys were the ones that hosted every single one of our original parity hearings all across this great country. And we need you now to help us continue to fight to implement parity. And the way we're going to do it is get the AGs to put the pressure, because Frederick Douglass said it the best. Power concedes nothing without demand. Never has, never will. Meaning you're never going to get the coverage we want unless we fight for it. And I know all of you are fighters, because you wouldn't have signed up to be an MHA member if you weren't. So I'm honored to be with all of you today. Thank you for your advocacy.
Amy and Patrick, I'm just so glad we're on the same team.
Yeah.
Please give them both a hand for being here with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.